Okay, in this second video, I'm going to take you through all the deployment steps of actually running vPod in a real ACI fabric. Before I get started with that, I just wanted to quickly show you some of the stuff that I have already pre-deployed getting ready for that. Namely, the fact that I've done a second VMM integration specifically for AVE. Now, I'm not going to take you through all the configuration steps for that, but I'm just kind of showing you an example of what I got. The only thing that you probably need to be aware of and just remember that you have in place is the fact that when you do AVE, when you create your VLAN pool, in addition to the standard VLANs that will be in use, you have to create a new pool that is going to be used by AVE, but its role needs to be marked as internal. So I just have one big VLAN pool for all of my VM needs, whether it's vPod or standard VMware integration, but just make sure you have that extra group that's marked as internal when you're working with AVE. Now, with that being said, let's actually go to the next step of actually deploying vPod, and we're going to use the wizard. So that will be found under the Fabric tab, under Inventory, under the Quick Start area, and we'll click on Add Pod, and you can see the choices that we have, and clearly we're going to click on Add Virtual Pod. Okay, after clicking the wizard, it sort of tries to give you some explanatory steps about what's going to happen in here, so I'll click at the bottom, Get Started. The first thing that we need to add is what's called an external TEP pool. Now, if you remember some of the requirements from video number one, this is one of those primary ones. So for each existing physical pod, you're going to need to assign a new external TEP pool that is different from the internal TEP pool, and make sure that this external TEP pool is actually routable across your IPN. In my particular case, I've chosen the following two subnets, one for each of my pods. Remember, I have a multi-pod setup of 192.168.100 and 192.168.101. So I'll go ahead and click Next. The next thing that we need to do is we need to establish some parameters for the virtual pod itself. So that virtual pod, just like any pod, is going to need a unique ID. So I'm just going to call it pod 10. Just like everything else, we need to have an external TEP pool that is going to be used by this vPod. In my particular case, for the virtual pod itself, I've chosen 192.168.200.0. You can also see what other pods might be, what other TEP pools might be in use, but that doesn't really matter here. I've chosen a pool for the vPod. Now, there's this concept of a reserved IP. If you remember from video number one, the virtual pod needed to have a subnet and a default gateway, and we need to make sure we tell ACI, hey, listen, don't use certain addresses from the range because, hey, the default gateway of the router, or there's a HSRP group, etc., that I don't want you to accidentally pick and use as an address for ACI. So in my particular case, the only thing I want to reserve here is just the default gateway's address itself of this layer 3 WAN router that connects the vPod into my ISN. So I've gone ahead and filled in the values for all of these fields to save time. So I've got my pool of reserved IPs is really just the network/30, which really means just reserve the gateway address. Just note if you are using HSRP or you have NTP or DNS or something running in that same subnet, that you include that in the reserved range. In my case, I just have the gateway, so it's very simple. Then the last step is to actually select a data plane TEP that represents the virtual pod, and in my case, I've just selected .254. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to give node numbers and router IDs and things like that for the virtual spines and virtual leafs in the vPod. So in my particular case, I'm going to establish some node numbers, and I'm going to pause the video and fill them in real quick for time. Okay, if you remember from the cheat sheet, I had to have some numbers already ready to go. So in my case, I have two virtual leaves of 2101 and 2102, and two virtual spines, 2201 and 2202. And I needed router IDs for each of those virtual spines, so I have selected out of my TEP pool for the vPod of addresses of 200.21 and 200.22. Now, because I'm using the wizard, I must fill in all of these fields. In my lab environment, I'm really only able to deploy one vLeaf and one vSpine. So if you're wondering where these extra things came from that don't show up on the cheat sheet, that's why. But in a production environment, you would ideally have these things in the proper ESX cluster as described in the first video. So at this point, I'll go ahead and click Next. This next particular step is it's saying, hey, we wanted to do, or we needed to have a VMM integration so that we can attach this AVE device and make the vPod whole. This is where I recommend, you don't have to, but I strongly recommend that you have this done ahead of time. And I'll just go ahead and select the VMM domain that we had pre-created already for sake of time. And at that point, I'm going to click finish. Now, after clicking finish, it gives me a summary of what I've done, but it's important to point out a couple of things. The first is this APIC passphrase here. You're going to need to copy that. And second of all, it's telling you which external TEP address has been handed out automatically to represent where your APICs are in your physical ACI environment. This is the address that you're going to have to set as your DHCP forwarder in your WAN router that's fronting your vPod, so that it points to this address. The spines, which I'll show you in just a moment, are handling that for you, and everything will work as desired. Sometimes about this APIC passphrase, you might see that it's valid for X number of minutes. Don't worry about if you forgot to copy it or you clicked OK before you copy it, because you can find that under the System tab, under APIC passphrase, and this is the passphrase. When it changes in 51 minutes, you can get the next passphrase as well. And just quickly looking at the layer 3 WAN router, which in my particular case, I'm just borrowing an interface from my IPN. Just note that this was the address that APIC told us was handed out as for vPod, and this is what I used to set up my DHCP relay address. And if we shift over and take a quick view into the spine in my physical ACI fabric, you'll see that if I type the command show NAT table, that the spine has automatically set up a mapping between the private IP of APIC from my original internal TEP pool of 10.0.0.1 and has mapped it to an IP in the external TEP pool that I've set up for vPod, in this case 100.227. This is the mapping of the reachability of APIC internally and externally for vPod. In my lab, I only have one APIC. If you had 3 APICs like a production setup, you would see 3 entries here and set up your relay appropriately. Now that we've completed the wizard configuration in APIC and we had a quick look at the WAN configuration and the NAT table in the spine, let's look at the other half of the equation to complete the vPod. In this particular case, I'm logged into my vCenter and I'm looking at the ACI plugin for vCenter here. This is one of the requirements in order to deploy this or Python. Please also note that we are not using the HTML5 interface yet. We have to use the old Flash-based Flex client with the ACI plugin. That is being worked on and will soon be corrected, but for now, this is the client that we must use. So this is the view of my vCenter of the ACI plugin, and where I click here is I go to Infrastructure, and in the Infrastructure view, you see I've got some tabs here at the top, so let's go into vPod. Now, if we have a quick look here, we have to first select a virtual pod. We might have more than one. In my case, I only have one, and it's called vPod 10, and this is the information that it picked up from APIC. You'll also see that I've got 2 virtual spines and 2 virtual leaves sitting there ready to go, but they have not yet been deployed, which is what we're going to do next. In this particular case, because I only have one ESX host, only one virtual leaf and one virtual spine will ultimately be deployed in my lab. If you had a production environment, obviously you would have the appropriate ESX hardware and the cluster and be able to deploy both. So down here, I have an ESX host that's existing in my vPod site that I'm going to deploy the virtual leaves and virtual spines to. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that ESX host. I do have to select a version. In this case, I've only got one version uploaded. I do have to have some port groups set up ahead of time. So in my particular environment, I have just a standard local vSwitch on this host 115, and I've set up 2 different port groups that I manually configured. One for out-of-band management. This allows you to SSH into the leaf and spine and actually issue commands, troubleshoot things like that. So I will go ahead and put that into my management port group. And the second port group that you need to have set up is for infra. This is so that the virtual leaves and spines and AVE have a segment that they can all communicate on and do what they need to do. And I created one called vPod infra. This is, again, just a local port group for these guys to talk. We have to select a data store. I'm going to just go ahead, I'll say custom I can say, I think I'm going to use the local data store here, so the defaults are fine. And then the last thing is the APIC passphrase. So if you remember, I showed you when you completed the wizard or under the system settings, it gave you a time bounded APIC passphrase. That's what you actually paste here. And then you say deploy vPod. So what's happening now is this particular plugin is going to go to your vCenter and pull the OVA from the content library and start deploying the virtual leaves and virtual spines. Now I'll note this is going to take a number of minutes to copy down, to spin up the VM, and things like that. So I'm going to pause the video, and when these are all fully deployed, we'll come back and see what it looks like. Maybe one other interesting thing to look at while we're waiting for the VMs to deploy and spin up is what it now looks like in APIC. So you can see we've got our pod 10. I'm under the Fabric Inventory tab, and I'm looking at Fabric Membership. And if I go into the view of nodes pending registration, you can actually see that I've got my 2 virtual leaves and 2 virtual spines here with the appropriate nodes in the appropriate pod. They're currently undiscovered because they haven't yet fully deployed in vCenter. But what will happen is when they deploy and spin up, APIC is automatically going to see them, discover them, and register them, in which case my single vLeaf and vSpine in my lab environment will move over to registered nodes. Okay, after about 5-10 minutes or so, everything has deployed and spun up, and we can see in the view of vCenter with the ACI plugin that we have deployed 1 virtual leaf, 1 virtual spine on host 115. Management IP addresses have been handed out. I have DHCP set up on that segment, so they'll grab a DHCP address, and everything so far is looking good. If we take a quick look over at APIC, we can see from the nodes pending registration, 2 devices, 1 virtual leaf, 1 virtual spine, have moved over and were automatically registered into my active environment with the proper node IDs, with the proper roles. Notice that TEP addresses from the external TEP pool for this particular vPod 10 have appropriately been handed out. Everything is looking good. Now, there's one more step to do, because what we've done is we've deployed just the control plane aspect of the virtual leaves and virtual spines. We still need to deploy the AVE for data plane services. So back in the vCenter plugin, let's click on the AVE tab and expand out and find our host here. And we can see that it recognizes that 115 is attached to my AVE VMM domain that I showed you earlier, but we haven't yet actually installed the AVE virtual switch yet. So what I have to do is I have to select that particular host. And again, much like the vPod control plane, you have to make some choices. In this particular case, I've got only one version of the AVE device. I have to select a management port group. Again, this was a port group that I had set up ahead of time. Data store, again, I'm just going to stay local here. And this next thing is we have to set up a password to log in into the AVE for like SSH troubleshooting and things like that. So this is where you will create an appropriate password that you will use, for troubleshooting and whatnot. Now, the only other thing that we have to really check here is you can deploy AVE without vPod, completely separate from what I've been showing you. But if you deploy it in vPod, what we see here is we have to tick this box in the end called vPod, and then select the appropriate pod where we want this to be deployed. And then finally, as the last step, click Install Upgrade ACI Virtual Edge, and it will go ahead and deploy them. Now again, this is spinning up an OVA from the content library. It's got to copy it down, it's got to start it up, it's got to join. So this is going to take a few minutes, so I'll pause the video again real quick and we'll come back and see what we see. Okay, after a couple of minutes, AVE has fully deployed, and if we take a look in the vCenter with ACI plugin, we can see that it's online. We can see its version. We can see that it's running in what we call cloud mode, or it's running with a vPod, so to speak. The name of the VM that got spun up, and of course its management IP for troubleshooting and whatnot. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch, in a confusing way, I'm going to go back to the HTML5 interface, because for me it's easier to show a couple of things that I want to show. So just logged into the HTML5 interface, 115 is the host that it lives in my vPod, and we can see I've got a couple of things deployed, my virtual leaf, my virtual spine. Remember, only one of each got deployed because I only have one host here. If I had 2 hosts in the cluster, the other host would get the corresponding members of leaf and spine. But again, this is just a lab environment, so no big deal. We can also see that the AVE got deployed. There's a couple of other quick things just down and dirty to check if things are working as expected. If you click into one of the virtual spines here and we have a look at the IP addresses, we can see that it got handed out addresses from the external TEP pool, which is what we want to see. If you look at the virtual leaf, again, you'll see that it got an address handed from the external TEP pool for this vPod. These are all things that indicate that DHCP relay is working, that the infrastructure, it can all see each other, and all of that kind of stuff. And finally, the AVE will also have its own address from the pool as well. But again, these are just quick and easy checks. I'm not going to show you detailed troubleshooting here just for sake of time. So at this point, I think we'll end this video, and I'm going to do the next video where I actually show the testing. So stay tuned for that.